Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW. Let the team at Black Hills Information Security test your defenses. With over 10 years of experience in penetration testing, red teaming, and threat hunting, the testers at Black Hills will help you find the holes in your security before the bad guys do. The team at Black Hills cares about educating and sharing their knowledge by creating countless blogs, open source tools, and webcasts for you to learn more about the tradecraft of pen testing and red teaming. Visit securityweekly.com/BHIS to join their mailing list and view the latest blogs and webcasts from Black Hills Information Security. Effectively securing your organization and its reputation requires a smarter approach. To maximize efficiency and minimize risk, security experts turn to LogRhythm, the only leading solution built solely for security teams by a security team committed to your success. With Next-Gen SIEM, user and entity behavior analytics, network traffic and behavior analysis, security automation and orchestration, and compliance, LogRhythm provides security made smarter. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. Of course, some of you have told us that you're overwhelmed by the amount of content that we produce. You may also be wondering if we have other shows, which we do. If you're wondering if we have an entire show on Application Security Weekly with some really smart people, we have that. You can go to securityweekly.com/subscribe, subscribe to any of our shows, and join a mailing list that will eventually lead to you being notified when content is produced that is in your interests. So you can go to securityweekly.com/subscribe. Check it out. Jack Jones is here with us. He's worked in technology, information security, and risk management for over 30 years. He's worked with several Fortune 100 financial companies, and today is the chief risk scientist at RiskLens and the chairman of the FAIR Institute. Jack, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Jack, I wanted to talk about a problem that I've spoken with many enterprises about, many enterprise practitioners over the years, and that's how do they basically prioritize vulnerabilities and risk? And that's essentially what it comes down to. They look at all of the issues and problems and missing patches, configurations in their organization, and they're like, how do I know which one to patch first? What's your take on this common challenge that we face today?
Well, it certainly is a non-trivial sort of problem, but I think in some ways our profession makes it harder than it has to be. An example is CVSS, which is generally the scoring model for technical vulnerabilities and such. And although it does a good job of characterizing the exploitability of various deficiencies and such, it's nowhere close to being an accurate representation of how much risk exists, because it leaves out of the equation a couple of the really critical factors in understanding how much loss exposure a problem represents. It's not just how exploitable a condition might be. A big factor is, well, is this condition directly internet facing or is it internal? Because you have very different threat event frequencies in those two environments. The value and liability characteristics of the assets at risk are also not taken into account, right? An asset with a particular vulnerable condition that is not critical to the business and has no sensitive information is not as important as one that is critical or that does have sensitive information. That isn't to say that that first system couldn't be used as a stepping stone to the valuable systems, but again, that the fact that the bad actor has to take that additional step means you have more time in which to detect and that sort of thing. But the bottom line is, too often in our industry, we take sort of at face value the results that some of our tools give us. And that generates a tremendous amount of noise that makes it really hard to focus on the things that matter most.
Yeah.
So I think that's one significant problem. Another significant dimension of the problem is if you ask a dozen information security practitioners to um, give you an example of a quote unquote risk, you're going to get dramatically different things. They'll be kind of all over the place, which means we're operating from a inconsistent and poorly defined um, set of nomenclature, and that has a remarkable effect on our ability to measure, well, evaluate, measure, and then focus on the things that matter most.
I agree. And some of our audience will come to me and say, and I'll give the example based on your description, even that some organizations will say, look, if it has a CVSS score of 7.0 or greater, then it's a high priority, and anything less is not a priority, right? And you're giggling already because, I mean, and some people will try and defend that and say, well, I had to start somewhere. I had to go to my upper management and set some policy around, prioritization of fixing. In that sense, okay, it's a positive, but we want to evolve beyond that, right? Because in your description, I agree, a CVSS score is about the vulnerability itself, not how it impacts your organization.
Right. Yeah, and I understand and commiserate with their position, wanting to start somewhere. The problem with the starting point we've been operating from, at least in my experience, is the noise that it generates.
Mm-hmm.
And so, let's say our organization has 1,000, vulnerabilities that have been rated 7 or above. Unless we um, unless we go to the trouble of sort of triaging those to get better fidelity, then we're faced with a couple of problems. We can either expend a tremendous amount of resources trying to patch all of those, and they absolutely are not all created equal, but we're going to treat them that way. And so that's a lot of resource expenditure that is suboptimal. Those resources could be spent elsewhere doing more important things. And let's say we take that, we try to go that route. We're going to treat all of those things as equally important. And let's say as a result, we just can't. We do not have the resources to patch all of those. And let's say our policy says anything we're going to treat critical like that has to be done in 7 days. Maybe that's just not possible. And so half of them take 30 days and a few of them take 60 days or 90 days and that sort of thing. And then lo and behold, what happened is some of the ones we chose more or less at random and were able to treat in the first 7 days, some of those weren't all that important. And some of those that we waited 90 days to treat were really important and we got burned.
Yep.
Set ourselves up for serious liability related pain because we had a policy we weren't living up to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because of that policy and our inability to focus appropriately, we delayed remediation on something that truly was critical while treating things that weren't critical, really aggressively. So it's just dangerous all around.
Mm. Now, Jack, it says that you're the creator of the Factor Analysis of Information Risk, or FAIR framework. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I created that and began working on that in 2001 when I was the new CISO at Nationwide Insurance. And I began working on it because as a new CISO, you have to create a strategy and then beg for money and such. And so I put together a strategy and went to executives, and one of the executives listened to my spiel and then said, "So tell me, Jack, how much risk do we have?" And I was hoping he was going to ask me to talk about threats and vulnerabilities because I could have talked all day. He said, "How much risk do we have?" And I shrugged and I said, "Well, lots." And he said, "If I spend these millions of dollars you're asking for, how much less risk will I have?" And I said, "Well, less." And as you can imagine, that was an uncomfortable moment. But
Sure.
he knew I wasn't going to have a better answer. It was a teaching moment. He was telling me, Jones, until you can speak in these terms, you're just really expensive noise.
Mm.
And I took the lesson to heart, and I said, this cannot be an intractable problem. And so I set about research. I spent about a year researching all the quote-unquote risk assessment methodologies in our profession, most of which fundamentally haven't changed, and found that none of them enabled me to answer those questions.
Hmm.
So I set about trying to figure it out myself, and I'm a curious and persistent kind of guy. So, and I had access to really smart people there. Being an insurance company, I had access to actuaries and underwriters and people who could help me stay off of thin ice in my approach. Mm-hmm. But the other advantage I had too was I was a practicing CISO. This had to be pragmatic. It had to be accessible. You know, I'm not a quant by nature. A lot of people find that hard to believe, but I'm not. And so I think the fact that I was a practicing CISO and it couldn't be a highfalutin science project really helped me to keep it grounded and pragmatic. And the fact that I don't have a PhD in math or anything like that also helped sort of keep it reasonable from a complexity perspective.
And what's different about the FAIR framework from some of those other risk models that really kind of led to its success and adoption as an international standard?
It's different in that, you know, if you ask people what risk framework or risk measurement or management framework they're using, you know, they'll say NIST-CSF or they'll say ISO something or other, or they'll, you know, they'll use they'll reference one of these frameworks, and invariably those frameworks are essentially controls checklists, best practices checklists, or maturity models. They aren't answering the question, how much loss exposure does this, that, or the other represent? They're wonderful for identifying deficiencies, and they're crucial for that, but they don't provide the so what. FAIR is a model for measuring loss exposure, measuring risk. And that is the difference. It's fundamentally different and complementary to the frameworks that our profession tends to rely on for identifying deficiencies.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the frameworks do a good job of identifying threats and vulnerabilities, but a poor job of providing that box to go, well, what's the impact, right?
Exactly.
And that's the important part, I think, is what you're saying.
Yeah, how much do we care? If we do a NIST-CSF examination and we discover that this element or that element is rated a 1 and we think it should probably be a 3, well, all right, if we're going to spend the money getting to a 3, what does that translate to in terms of a reduction in loss exposure? I mean, that is the thing is that I think oftentimes doesn't really go explicitly recognized is that everything we do in the cybersecurity realm, at least everything we do, should affect either the probability or the magnitude of loss occurring. You know, from your firewalls to your passwords to your access privileges to your testing, your pen testing, your reporting to all of these things in some way either directly or indirectly affect the frequency and magnitude of loss. That is the value proposition statement for everything we do. How does it affect the frequency and or magnitude of loss? And when we can express that value in those terms, I have never had an executive in the business side of the house have any problem understanding that. It's incredibly clarifying for them, and you're able to do cost-benefit analysis. You're able to, and sometimes the benefit is you go to them and you say, you know, you heard about this thing in the news. It doesn't matter to us, and here's why. And we could take these steps, but there's no cost benefit to it, right? So it's both an opportunity to to explain and defend where expenditures and efforts should be placed and maybe why some policy should be this or that. But it's also an opportunity to say, hey, don't sweat this over here. And you'd be surprised how well, or maybe you wouldn't be, how well received that is by executive management when they know that you've done your homework and can explain, the why.
I love the expression of risk as probability and magnitude. I feel as security practitioners, we tend to be really good at explaining the magnitude, right? The like, if this happens, like all these bad things, like we're really good at like running that through our heads and going, well, if someone were to get in that system, right, they could do some serious damage. And I feel like that's magnitude. Probability is something that, myself included, I think we have a tough time explaining to management the probability of something happen, because a lot of times management's like, oh, but that's not going to happen to us, or the likelihood of that. How do you define probability, Jack?
Yeah, it's a combination of the threat event frequency. How often are these sorts of events, these sorts of attacks, let's say, likely to occur? And maybe we have good data on that, or maybe we don't have good data on it. And we can come back to that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one dimension of it. The other dimension, it comes back to essentially the resistive capabilities of the organization. So you have these attacks that have some frequency, through one vector or another. Maybe it's phishing, maybe it's some sort of probing of our internet-facing application. But there are frequencies of these things. And then what is the likelihood, given our control conditions, what is the likelihood that those attacks and or probes will be successful in creating a loss event? And when you sort of begin to decompose these questions regarding probability and the factors that drive probability, you get a tremendous amount of clarity from that, and you begin to find data you didn't know you have, begin to find ways of using the data that you have, and that process also gives you the foundation for explaining and defending your position to executives or regulators or auditors or whoever, right?
It's interesting. A lot of times when we talk about probability, we tend to consider the skill level of the attacker and their motivation to come after our organization. Does that come into probability to say, well, this could happen, but it would take a really advanced adversary and they're likely to target us because of X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, that's certainly part of the process of that, we're going through that evaluation and measurement. But I think it's useful too to keep in mind that you can carve the threat landscape into two buckets. The threat actors who are opportunistic, they're just scanning hither and yon, looking for anything they can bust, right? They aren't selectively targeting. Then you have those that are selective, right? They're saying, we want or need to break into this organization for these reasons. It may be national security related, or it could be purely cybercrime, whatever, right? But they are selecting. And you want to keep that consideration comes into play both with regard to the frequency of attacks, the sophistication of attacks, the vectors and or targets of attacks, that sort of thing. So it's sort of this process of thinking maybe a little more deeply about the attacks and how they occur and such than is maybe normal for a lot of practitioners. But those extra steps in analysis are what give you results that you can stand behind and explain. Right?
I've always felt like when we talk about insider threats that we kind of have to adjust our models, right? Because it's someone who does become an adversary potentially at some point. And I've always felt that they're less frequently occurring, but a lot more damaging when they do happen. How do you factor that into your risk equations?
So here again, it's at least how I approach, and I found this to be successful, is The insiders. One of the things I like to do when I'm presenting to an audience is I'll ask, how many of them have at one point or another been a disgruntled insider? And every hand goes up. Everybody's been pissed at their employer. But they, these are jaywalkers, right? They aren't the mass murderers. So I've had conversations with people in our profession who say, well, no, inside, malicious or detrimental inside acts happen all the time. Well, yeah, but those are the jaywalkers. And we can treat them as a separate threat population and analyze those scenarios differently from the ones that are far less frequent but more damaging. And that's important. That differentiation is important for two reasons. The frequency is different and the impact is different, right? And when you munge those two populations together, you end up with results that really don't stand up and make sense. So it's, I'm glad you asked that question, because that's just another good example for, if we take a moment to really think about the scenarios that we're concerned about and the differences, sometimes the nuanced but really important differences between them. When we take that time to really think about it, it makes what seems like an incredibly difficult analysis much, much easier.
Mm. For those listening that want to learn more about the FAIR framework, how do people get started? Where do they go? And what are some of the initial steps, Jack?
Yeah, so a little over 3 years ago, we stood up a nonprofit called the FAIR Institute, and it's fairinstitute.org. And it has a very active blog page with over 400 blog posts over the last 3 years, where you can find a lot of information. Membership is free. And there are a lot of white papers and case studies and whatnot there. I think that's an excellent resource for people who want to learn more. The Open Group, which is an international standards consortium, has adopted FAIR as an international standard and offers a professional certification around it. Mm-hmm. They have a website, and you can find all sorts of free resources there. So those are really good resources. There's a book out there that I co-authored with a colleague a few years ago called Measuring and Managing Information Risk, a FAIR Approach, that was actually inducted into the cybersecurity canon a couple of years ago. So that's out there also.
That's fantastic. Jack, thank you so much for appearing on the show. I loved the information. I've been doing this almost 20 years now, and you helped me think differently about risk, which is really saying something. So thank you so much for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Thanks for having me.
And that will end the show for today. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.